Colleagues, can I just kindly request that we come in the inner circle because there's so few people inside here? Thank you. Colleagues, good afternoon. I think we could wait long, but I understand there are other conflicting and sessions that are happening somewhere else, I understand. Anyhow, I shall introduce myself. My name is Musonda Mumba. I'm with UN Environment, and I head the Terrestrial Ecosystems Program for UN Environment. And I'm also the co-lead on the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration within the agency. So to start with, before I delve deep, I think I'll just show a very short video that was done by colleagues of ours in Afghanistan, looking at the post-conflict and also restoration linkages. Here we go.
We spent the first 3 days interviewing people and trying to pinpoint the location of wild stands of pistachio using old Soviet land cover maps. It turned out that the situation was worse than we had expected. At every location we visited that had pistachio in 1950, there wasn't a single tree left standing. After returning to Geneva, we analyzed our field data and used satellite images to complete the picture. The results confirmed our worst fears. The pistachio woodlands that once covered 91% of Baghis province are now so degraded that they can no longer even be detected by the satellites. If something wasn't done immediately, what would be the future for rural life? In all likelihood, it was one of two options. Either entire villages would leave their homes looking for greener pastures, or new generations would pick up arms and fight over the remaining scraps. Either path would undermine the reconstruction process and further compound the existing poverty. We spent the first 3 days
So just speaking to that video, I mean, I'm preaching to the converted here. You're all familiar with the levels of degradation in different parts of the world. This is one of the landscapes where we've been working, at least for the last nearly 20 years, as part of the post-conflict work, but really in relation to natural resources. But as you can see, the levels of degradation are even higher, and more recently, my colleague Matthias is here, we're working in Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan looking at snow leopards, and this is also part of the range of snow leopards. So we see that biodiversity is navigating, or even whether it's plant biodiversity is disappearing in these very fragile and yet beautiful landscapes. And so I want to also recognize my colleague Adriana from IUCN, who's been instrumental and also involved very much in this process for this particular decade. I'm going to talk a little bit about the journey and the process of how this came about for those of you who may not be familiar. Excuse me. So last year, conversations between the government of El Salvador, IUCN, and also our colleagues within the Global Landscapes Forum Charter basically were approached, and thankfully to IUCN as well, having discussions with the government of El Salvador, they presented a request to actually have the first ever UN decade on ecosystem restoration. And as such, as you know, with multilateral processes, this requires that this thing is tabled under the UN General Assembly process. So it was tabled last year in September. And thankfully, I think there's a recognition around the world that the whole restoration agenda is so critical for the world. And on the 1st of March, this came through as a UN General Assembly resolution. I don't have copies of the resolution with me here, but if you need any copies, just let me know. Otherwise, we can email that to you. Now, what does that mean? That meant that there's now a commitment from the United Nations system to make sure that this particular resolution goes forward. And also, one of the requests from this resolution was that we undertake consultations with all the Rio Conventions, and hence why we're here today. So we've already undertaken some initial consultations. The decade itself is from 2021 through to 2030. So it officially kicks off January of 2021. So between now and January of 2021, there's several consultations happening. We met as the core team, UN Environment, IUCN, FAO, the Global Landscapes Forum team in Bonn in March to really brainstorm and come to an agreement in terms of what it is that we were supposed to undertake. In fact, we did not even anticipate that this was come through as a General Assembly resolution. So that happened. And then in June, we had consultations on the margins of SB 50 in Bonn with UNFCCC member states and civil society as well. And now we have CBD, and September, we're going to have consultations with UNCCD in India. Member states, my colleagues will be there, and also in New York on the margins of the Secretary General's Climate Summit, which is happening that week of the 23rd. And also there'll be some discussions on the margins of COP25 in Chile. And ultimately, we're going to have continued discussions and consultations. We hope and anticipate that actually the official launch, even though it hasn't kind of been ironed out, will happen at the CBD COP next year, just before the beginning of the actual decade. One thing I also want to just let everyone know is that we actually are aligning this decade with existing decades within the UN system, such as the UN Decade on Family Farming, that has just come through FAO. And also, because this is a UN General Assembly resolution, 2 UN agencies were requested to take a lead on this. That is ourselves, UN Environment, and FAO. UN Environment is going to be responsible for the advocacy and awareness element of the decade, hence the website that you see on the screen. And FAO is going to be involved on the technical elements. But of course, we have a core team that also includes IUCN that's involved in really sharing and also providing a lot of technical input into this. Finally, I also want to mention that we've just hired a couple of people to develop a strategy of how we're going to undertake this decade, because I think it will be the most immersive decade that includes everyone across the world. And also a communication strategy that is being developed as well. And we're hoping and anticipating that the consultants will be reaching out to you and really having discussions in terms of what is it that you'd like to see, at least by the time this decade is being launched. As you can see, we've just rolled out the website, and you can see that there are no logos there. We do not have a UN logo, and we are just developing a visual identity of sorts, because we want this to be owned by the world, by everyone. And hence why we also have Decade on Ecosystem Restoration and have dropped UN there, because we want it to be collective and useful. So you will see in this website, which is pretty self-explanatory, you know, what is ecosystem restoration, what is the decade about, and also some stories that are shared. But it also gives you the option to also share your stories as well from all over the world. What I also want to mention is that for a lot of people, some of the questions that we've received were, you know, is this decade about forests? No, it's about all the ecosystems across the world. Be it wetland systems, be it rangelands, be it mountain ecosystems, it's about all ecosystems. And also one of the elements of the actual resolution, it does flag, in fact, if I may refer to the quote within the resolution on the importance of this decade, it does refer to the CBD process, that recognizing the importance of the 5th meeting of the Conference of the Parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity to be held in China in 2020, in formulating a post-2020 global biodiversity framework that will contribute to the conservation, keyword conservation, of biodiversity on the planet, and thus facilitate and reduce the need for ecosystem restoration. And you will see through this particular resolution that a lot of the text is really making reference to conserving. Can we conserve what we have, really, that is in good status, as opposed to really advocating for restoration and unsustainable use of ecosystems? So this is where we are, and so this process really for the next maybe 45 minutes, we just want to hear from you, your thoughts, and really just telling us what it is that you want, or if you like, you just tell us some suggestions on how we go forward, and it will be a continued conversation, I think. So the floor is open. And I just want to also recognize my colleague Aline is here. She's part of the team that's working on the decade, and also my colleague Marietta, who's a coordinator on ecosystems management, under which a lot of this work is also going to be anchored. So we have a group of us that are here, including, of course, our IUCN colleagues, to answer any questions. Thank you so much. And so if you want to make an intervention, if you can just introduce yourself so we know who you are. Thank you. Harry?
Thank you. I will intervene quickly because I have to run out. Not because this is not important, but there are so many other commitments we have. We are glad to be here, and we've been part of this for CBD process. CBD Secretary has been part of this right from the beginning, and we are happy that the UN General Assembly finally agreed to adopt a resolution to establish, to initiate this decade. And I think the ball is now in our court, and it's very rare to get the UN General Assembly to adopt something like this, very specific, on a specific topic or undertaking. So we need to see how we can maximize this. I had a question why you opted to leave out the UN logo, because for me, UN is UN. It's not just the body in New York, but it's a universal kind of appeal. And I would have imagined actually it's an asset rather than a disadvantage to have a UN logo on such an initiative. When you go to some stakeholders in different countries, the UN is taken in that, seen in that high light, and it shows the importance of the topic and the activity. So, but I'm sure you had reasons why, but perhaps it's something you can reconsider. And I can understand maybe attaching particular other institutions that might be problematic, but UN as UN, I think perhaps it might not be so controversial. Then with regard to what's happening with the consultations, I assume there will be consultations at lower levels as well in preparation for the launch, because I believe this should be bottom up. Restoration is not in New York, Vienna, or Montreal. Restoration is going to be on the ground. And the more we can mobilize and popularize this and energize people on the grassroots before the launch, I think to make it more successful. And if you can start having it in the news even before the launch, I think this might give it greater momentum than seeing it from top down. And perhaps we can work with key players working on with the local communities, institutions, IUCN, the WWF. You already have your networks. I'm sure you can already get to mobilize those networks from the bottom up, and by the time we come to the global launch, it's like the fire's already caught up and ready to move, and also starting to engage political actors, right from local level political actors to national level political actors to international level political actors. So mobilizing it from the ground up, I think, will give this real momentum and real seriousness that it desires. So I think I'll leave it at that. I can come in and intervene more if I'm still around. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll just respond very quickly in relation to the logo. What we did, you can see the middle text does not have UN. However, at the very top, we have United Nations Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. And that is the only bit that we're referring to the United Nations. We're going to have a visual identity. And if you see a number of the other UN decades, generally have had a visual identity that shows what the decade is all about, but with a reference to the UN on there. So we'll not necessarily have UN Environment logo or FAO logo, but we do mention the partners towards the end, because I think there's several stakeholders who've been involved in this process as well. That's right. Sure.
Talking about UNEP logo, but rather UN in general, the logo of the UN. So.
Yeah, so we just do a mention at the very top, as you can see, just here. That's what we agreed as a collective. Great. Laurent?
Thank you, Musonda. Thanks for inviting us and also for the introduction. As you certainly know, WWF across its network has been very supportive of this resolution in the UNDK. So we did really applaud when we got the news that this was passed by the General Assembly. I would have maybe two questions, one to you and one to Levis. Is Levis? Okay. I need more powerful glasses too. The first one is, as you also know, in Sharm el-Sheikh, the ministers, African ministers, has adopted this Pan-African Action Agenda on restoration. I want to see what would be actually the benefit for such agenda action when we have actually this UN decade that has been actually approved by the resolution that was approved by the UN. What is the benefit for a region like Africa, and particularly for this program that's been actually adopted by the ministers. And right after the meeting in the COP14, or in the margin of the COP, there was a gathering. The African Union has actually called upon a certain number of partners to already start thinking on how we operationalize actually the program. Since then, we have not heard anything. There was really a good recommendation, particularly setting up a coordination mechanism, and some actions are already. So I don't know where we are with this process. I know that NEPAD was heavily involved, the UNF, AUC. I don't know if you were at that meeting in Sharm el-Sheikh. So maybe if we can update us where we are as we are celebrating and now we're engaging into the celebration of the UN decade.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Loro. Actually, the African countries, during the August Global Landscape Forum, the Minister of Rwanda joined with the Minister of El Salvador to co-sponsor, kind of to join hands in recommending that a resolution on the decade on ecosystem restoration needs to be adopted by the UN General Assembly. And even before that, restoration had been identified by the African countries as a priority. Going forward, even as we go into the post-2020 discussion, they still look at restoration as a priority for African countries. And therefore, the momentum was being built in anticipation of this decade coming into being. And then the African countries were saying, what will it look like in the African region, and what will be the priorities for Africa in embracing a UN decade on ecosystem restoration. So first, restoration is a priority for Africa, as we have seen from the IP-based assessments. They all point to that if we address ecosystem restoration, we will, in effect, be addressing the loss of biodiversity. So the assessment on biodiversity and ecosystems for the Africa region, but also the assessment on land by AP-BES were the key inputs into the process of African countries coming up with this priority. So I'm not a member state, but following very closely what the African countries process within the CBD and within the African Union processes, they see the Pan-African Action Agenda on ecosystem restoration as their response. It will be their response, the framework for response to this decade. So we have had a number of meetings, and I will ask Eri also, CBD Secretariat is actively engaged in this process. But we have had a number of meetings to, as you said rightly, to establish the coordinating system or committee. There's an interim coordinating committee pending the establishment of a formal committee. But the interim committee is charged with the responsibility of coming up with an implementation plan, with a communication strategy. There is actually what we are calling the Africa Eco Voices as a communication project to support the Pan-African Action Agenda on ecosystem restoration. So the process is being put in place, only that the African Union Summit decided to elevate NEPAD into a development agency. It's now called the African Union Development Agency, AUDA, NEPAD. And that has necessitated a transition, which is expected to take about a year to complete. And in the transition, there is a realignment and restructuring within NEPAD in order to take up its new mandate as a development agency. This is where momentum Loro has slightly slowed down because NEPAD has been given this mandate by the African Ministerial Summit on Biodiversity in Sharm el-Sheikh on the 13th of November. So in brief, the Pan-African Action Agenda is the vision of African countries, the framework for Africa to contribute to the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. But ERI is also very closely associated with this.
Thank you, Levis. I also want to add very quickly that we're going to actually have the Global Landscapes Forum in Accra, 29th to the 30th of October, and the theme of the theme of this GLF meeting is actually Africa Restoration Agenda. And as such, it's a lot of stakeholders from the ground up to really share experiences and also opportunities. And just to add up a little, to complement a little bit about what Levis has said, I also want to mention that I think one of Africa's largest agenda around restoration is the Great Green Wall. And in fact, a film has just come out which will be shown officially at the UNCCD COP in India. And I think this, for me, is one of the biggest restoration agendas that has ever happened on this continent. And we're already discussing with other regions in terms of, what are the restoration agendas that are actually happening and what are the issues that are being addressed. So I'll leave it there. George?
Thank you very much. My name is George Akwa. I'm the ICN Regional Program Coordinator for Central and West Africa. Maybe starting with your last comment, I was going to ask what's the link of this initiative with the ongoing programs that might serve as a baseline. And also, obviously, there is a link with the Bond Challenge, but what's the link? I know, for instance, in some of the African countries, we have a COMIFA countries have committed quite a lot. They have been interministerial platforms and engagement that took some commitments towards restoration. And ECOWAS wants to go that direction as well. In the framework of the Bond Challenge, I think Adriana is here. She can say a little bit more about that. What's the link? And building on these concrete initiative, how do we move forward to piloting, learning, and upscaling? Just to be sure that we are not reinventing the wheel, but connecting and taking it forward.
Thank you so much. Very timely. So we co-authored this as a member of the Global Partnership for Forest and Landscape Restoration. There's a booklet, and it's over here, which I can share. IUCN is a member of this. We released this one last year, actually, on the margins of the GLF. And really what this booklet does is really explain some of the existing initiative. It's beautifully written, and it's very simple and straightforward. And the first thing that's mentioned is the Bond Challenge, among other initiatives. What exactly are we doing? And I think what we're advocating for and telling the world is that we're not starting from scratch. There's so many players and stakeholders doing incredible work around the world on restoration, but how do we galvanize collective effort and share experiences? Because people may know about the Great Green Wall in Africa, but beyond the continent, people are not aware of what, and what is its contribution to the collective sort of ecosystem. So I think this booklet also really does explain in detail a lot of initiatives that are ongoing. There's even a global map in there, which is really, really exciting. And all these are the partners who've been involved in this initiative, which is really, really exciting. And also stakeholders who really work on the ground, which is quite amazing as well. Congo Basin, of course, is one of our priority areas, and we've been consulting with some of the ministerial ideas. And just bringing it home here in Kenya, we met with the Ministers of Interior and Ministers of Environment, because Kenya also made a commitment at the UN Environment Assembly this March on having to green Kenya and do a lot of restoration. And already they're consulting with us and also linking to other countries on the continent to share experiences, because WRI actually supported the Kenyan government on doing what is the restoration landscape looking like. And I think that's what also governments are really asking for. Where do we begin? do we start with the forest? Do we go for the wetlands? Or, what are the levels of degradation around the countries? Or is it, if it's cross-border, when we look at shared ecosystems like the Lake Victoria, for example, what are the conversations within the context of the East Africa community? And it's great that you bring up ECOWAS, which is also really important as a regional economic body. So these are some of the conversations that are actually happening at the moment. Please, go ahead.
Okay, yes, I think one of the challenges we see is that, like any of these global commitments, we have government that engage, and then implementation is an issue related to institutional arrangement, resources, and so on. You take many African countries, they have committed. A country like Burkina Faso that committed to restore 5 million hectares. You have Rwanda with the border-to-border restoration programs and so on. But we need to really find means of implementation, not just engaging, committing, and not moving anywhere. So these are really some of the concrete things that have been strategized. The baseline is there, that can be piloted and build this up. And then my last question that I forgot is, how do you link this with the ongoing debate on biodiversity, the biodiversity framework? Some of the questions we've been asking is, what are the ecosystem-based targets that we include in the biodiversity, post-2020 biodiversity framework, to see that restoration is not just to plant trees or something like that, but to restore biodiversity at the ecosystem level.
Harry, do you want to respond to the latter?
Yeah, sure. No, yeah, definitely. Ecosystem restoration is central to the discussions that are taking place. There will be a thematic consultation specifically on this topic in Brazil. I think it's in October, as a way of determining what aspects will go into the framework, and then the supplementary either action plans that will accompany the framework, because the framework, of course, is an overarching document. No details will be there in terms of facilitating implementation. But this thematic consultation, I think, is going to identify what aspects will go into the framework itself, and what supplementary implementation plans or strategies, whatever it will be called, will be put in place to, once this is adopted in 2020, to facilitate implementation. And of course, all this will be linked with the decade. For me, I see the decade as an umbrella kind of a platform or means to galvanize and mobilize actors and give it that political clout to enable implementation. And the actual implementation will go through different processes, like now the post-2020 framework for biodiversity. I'm sure CCD might have something that is ongoing. So there will be different initiatives and different frameworks, all being supported by this decade as a political, giving it a political cover and the momentum it desires. So I think we should see this as an opportunity, all of us, through our different processes, that we should tag on to facilitate action in our respective processes. Maybe as I have a floor before I leave, going back to the issue that WWF raised, it's true the African continent already had mobilized itself even before the decade was adopted, and they have this Pan-African action agenda, which is quite comprehensive. And from what I understand, this is going to go to the AU heads of state for adoption at the upcoming assembly in February, which will give it even more political voice. But the challenge is now with the implementation. And we've had a number of meetings, and this is where I was saying we need to start moving away from meetings to start getting down, mobilizing actors on the ground, because otherwise this could go on and workshop after workshop and nothing is happening on the ground. So I think it's a challenge as we wait for all these political processes and the planning, workshops, assessment, to start mobilizing action and using these political frameworks to galvanize that mobilization, and also mobilizing resources to support implementation. Thank you.
Before I give the floor to Adriana, because I saw your hand, just very quickly to add on, one thing I'd like to mention is that we, as UN Environment, we've been working very closely with quite a number of private sector entities, because we also want private sector engagement in this process. And it really just does respond to also your question on how do we really get real action on the ground and also go just beyond planting trees. But one of the tree planting initiatives that has been done by this German young man called Plant for the Planet initiative, we've just worked with them fairly recently, and they are releasing an app where people across Europe can do a click and literally donate money directly to a community to do the actual restoration, even bypassing. So I think there's some innovative ideas that are emerging on what will actually happen on the ground and beginning to galvanize communities and also really do some real action from the bottom up. Adriana?
Okay, thank you. Adriana Vidal with IUCN. All right, okay. I just wanted to share a couple of ideas regarding what has been discussed so far. I understand that, especially for people who have been involved already for many years into these regional, international initiatives that promote restoration, specifically in forests, like the Bond Challenge, regional initiatives like AFR 100 initiative 20 by 20 Latin America, and other ecosystem restoration initiatives. The question is, there is enough awareness, political will at that level for ecosystem restoration. So my reaction would be not necessarily, because even though amongst ourselves these terms sound very familiar, first, they are not widespread across all sectors in countries. So this might resonate with the Minister of Environment or the Minister of Agriculture if we're talking about I don't know, restoration in agricultural lands, but it doesn't necessarily go beyond that. And the lands and the challenge is to make these the benefits of ecosystem restoration relatable and to other sectors. So it's not only an environmental agenda, but also a developmental or an agenda for development. It might sound easy, but it is actually one of the key challenges of this decade at that level, at the political level. And then another thing I wanted to say regarding implementation, which is also connected with this, if countries are really on board across sectors, understanding that restoration of ecosystems is not only good for the environment, but also for other national priorities, then the ways of structuring finance for these activities, more funds might be able to channel for ecosystem restoration. That's the hope, at least. And of course, we also have a huge expectation for the involvement of the private sector, which, by the way, we are using the label of Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, but this concept is encompassing of many other initiatives where organizations like ours, like the UN Environment and others here in the room, are already working with the private sector to achieve similar outcomes. So I think it's just a matter of taking the opportunity of working based on this global initiative, raising the profile of this topic, joining the dots, and I guess that making the use of resources more efficient, because of course there will be limitations. So what we are also interested in seeing is that, of course, there will be an important source of finance that will need to come from cooperation organizations supporting developing countries, but the countries themselves also need to start thinking how, based on their resources, limited or not, they can put forward and advance some action. And yeah, the last thing I'll say is that ecosystem restoration also should target, I mean, it's at a global level, no? So it shouldn't target only the South Hemisphere. So I'm interested in seeing the reactions of countries on the, at the north. Like, what are they going to do about it? Thanks.
Thank you. Matthias?
Thank you very much. My name is Matthias Jurek. I'm working with UNEP and together with Musonda and other colleagues working in mountain ecosystems. I have a question. Obviously, of course, the decade provides the kind of umbrella of the activities on ecosystem restoration. And as we are engaging in, from my side in particular, with mountain countries who host in particular mountain ecosystems, what kind of message can you communicate to these countries if they're interested to make a kind of pledge in support of the decade? Should it be a kind of political pledge for project activities? I think this will be quite crucial also in the run-up to the CBD COP next year. And my second question is in this regards, as I believe that whatever the outcome will be of the CBD process, there will be obviously a strong pillar on ecosystem restoration, how that will probably align with the possibly voluntary commitments by the countries. Because I think as we're engaging with the countries and supporting them for work, and the countries are also discussing for the outcome document at the CBD, I think would be good to see how we can, engaging with the countries, get a commitment, in particular from governments. So further guidance in this respect would be much appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthias. But I do wish, I've seen a few government representatives at the back, but I do wish the government representative could actually respond to that, because they're the ones who have to make that commitment. I just want to add very quickly to what Adriana pointed out. I think the fact that we're seeing fires in the Arctic and Russia is clearly indicative that the whole restoration agenda is a global agenda, and it is not a southern agenda. So I think that in itself is very, very clearly evident, and I think this is something that's flagged within the resolution itself, as you very well know, since you're involved in the drafting of that. So I think this is also the messaging that's very critical. And also, I think one thing that emerged, and one of the things that came out during the consultations in Bonn, was very much that the South also has a lot to teach the North about some of the experiences around restoration, what's working, how it's worked, and how they've mobilized, etc. And the reverse is equally true as well. Matthias, in just sort of responding to that, I really do think that one of the champions of this particular restoration decade is the government of Germany. So Germany has been quite instrumental in really pushing other member states, including the EU bloc. And I think there are already discussions. We had a consultative meeting here in Nairobi where we briefed the EU delegation around why this particular decade matters. But also, I think the conversation is also happening at the sort of multilateral level, making sure that, AU-EU conversations are happening on what this actually means, and similarly in other regions as well. So that commitments are made. But then it also goes back to George's point about, yes, there are pledges and commitments. How do we go beyond that? So if we've committed many millions of hectares that are going to be restored, what does that actually mean in reality? And also, what does it cost to restore these ecosystems? So this is part of the conversation that's coming. The other question on the voluntary commitments, I'm not really sure about that. Maybe somebody who's involved in the process can respond to that. Okay. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, but I have to follow the other meeting. It is very interesting, Pierluigi Bozzi, International Coordinator of International University Network on Biodiversity and Cultural Diversity, establishing an agreement with the CBD Secretariat. So, as usual, decades are instrumental vehicles to not only galvanize, but also to implement in the reality, because there is a policy framework, there is a policy umbrella that we can consider at all the levels when we want to promote initiatives. There is a sort of justification, we can say. So, have you already discussed a platform of a set, we can say a set of channels we can use? For example, at national, international level, universities and civil society organizations can promote initiatives, but we need some channels and procedures in order to reach different levels, establish partnerships, receive support, not only in terms of financial support, receive endorsement from the decade, from the United Nations Decade Platform, but also at regional, sub-regional, national level. Very practical, very operative. If tomorrow morning we want to develop an initiative on ecosystem restoration in 3 African countries, what can we do to utilize the decade?
Thank you very much. So in the beginning, before you came in, I made an intervention where I mentioned that we're just in the middle of developing a strategy, and we have a consultant who's actually consulting globally with different sectors, and I'm happy to share my email and also introduce the consultant. Unfortunately, they could not be here at this meeting. So one of the elements, as you see from the website, is get involved, share what part can you play, etc. And what we're trying to do is to make sure that there are mechanisms and platforms where this information can easily be shared without having to control. But of course, there'll be a level of control with some guidelines in terms of what is it that you can share and tell us, etc. We're also working very closely with FAO in terms of guidelines as well. What does it actually mean to restore this kind of landscape, monitoring mechanisms, if it's an agroecological system, etc. And all of this will be included and shared along the way. And one thing that I mentioned earlier at the very beginning is that we were quite surprised that the decade came through on the 1st of March this year. So we were really kind of caught unaware. So all of a sudden we are trying to develop all these guidelines without resources, without existing resources within our respective institutions. So we're also trying to figure out, between March and now, we've only just managed to actually just get the website off. So we're trying to figure out along the way. And we also would like to hear from you how best we can, have this kind of information, or what has worked before in another decade, for example, and all of that. So which is why we are doing the consultations. Matthias?
One further idea just came to my mind. Of course, obviously, it would entail some work, but there's also plenty of very good, I think, solutions, positive solutions available on the Panorama platform, which is hosted by IUCN and GSZ and supported by our organizations, so which even a sub-portal on ecosystems. So I'm sure very interesting solutions, because the approach is very positive, can be from there, but of course, need some time to insert it on that website, of course, or maybe just a general linkage can be made to the other established website. Yeah.
Indeed. Thank you. This gentleman in the corner, please, if you can go ahead.
Yes, my name is Halldór Þorgeirsson. I'm chair of Iceland's Climate Council. And so I've been reflecting as I listen to you kind of how to actually make this have an impact in the real world. And I'm stating the obvious, but it's not that easy for UN to actually have an impact out in the real world. And so I welcome what you said about helping public participation in this, and also on the action side. We are all aware of the growing anxiety, for example, among the younger generations about where we are. And it's actually, it would be quite empowering for people to have opportunities to participate in restoration efforts. And there's quite a bit of experience where I come from in actually almost all of the reforestation is done by private citizens. And the largest single organization in Iceland is the reforestation organization. And so I would hope that this could actually be an opportunity to really get the message out that restoration is part of the solution. I'm not so sure that that's so today. And for example, if we look at the, so we need to speak up on that, and perhaps champions would be needed, possibly from the arts, from youth, from kind of the more creative part of society, to actually get people out and get engaged in restoration activities. And that's one point. The second point is, I'm sure you're thinking about this, but it's good to maybe reinforce it in your mind, and that is the direct relationship to livelihoods, immediate livelihood benefits, immediate being within the season. And that's one thing that is, I think, quite powerful. I mean, I felt the video that you showed was terribly depressing, actually, especially because where it ended. And you would ask the question, I mean, what happened then? And so what I'm basically calling for is a bit bold kind of signal that that restoration is part of this. And you mentioned that perhaps we should be looking at conservation as well, but I think it could actually confuse things if we are mixing it too much with conservation, because that's something that people understand. Of course, that needs to go forward. But as the 2050 vision of the Convention of Biological Diversity lists, I mean, it talks about valuing sustainable use, conserving, and restoring. And a lot of people haven't kind of paid attention to this. So what I would, you asked about the implications for the CBD. I think one of them would be to actually drum up a little bit more the role of restoration. And final point, I know that, I'm sure you're aware of this, but I just want to mention it, that there is a fairly active network of scientists engaged in ecosystem restoration, and they have a fairly active professional network. And so that's something to tap into as well. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Hermine?
Thank you. My name is Hermine Kleiman. I work for WWF International in the forest team. And so, like, first of all, we really, really welcome this UN decade, and we are really excited to, like, you know, kick it off in 2021. And we are also very, like, eager and keen to participate as much as we can. And we have a lot of experience in long-year standing experience in restoration. So we have tried to sort of, like, you know, get some views from the network on the decade. We still, like, sort of, like, I think need to like wordsmith a little bit to make it not sound like a position paper because it comes from policy people. So so there's some work to do on that. But maybe a couple of thoughts which came from the network, the wider network also is, like, one, I guess the focus is at the moment still on forests, because there's so much going on forests, with the AFR 100, with the Bonn Challenge, with the Global Partnership on Landscape Forestation, etc. So how can we make sure this is more inclusive in terms of taking more and other ecosystems on board beyond forests, even though I'm, you know, coming from the forests world. This is one key message which came from the network. And also how to track progress. So we have the Bonn Challenge Barometer, that's what I understand for forests and forest landscape restoration. Is there some sort of, like, thinking already if this is going to be extended and expanded to other ecosystems? Is there some sort of, like, thinking on that we would be very interested to better understand? And let me quickly, and what we experience at the moment, which is very positive but can also be a bit of risky, is that everyone wants to plant trees at the moment, and the private sector is, like, jumping on a lot of, like, organizations to, like, you know, help them planting trees to offset their emissions. And I think we need to also work a little bit on, quality and risks there, I guess. So I think we are really keen to see quality projects which serve multiple purposes, of course, like biodiversity, ecosystem restoration, but also livelihoods. So agroforestry, for instance, and especially food security, because there will be trade-offs. So that you have sort of like a balanced agenda of restoration activities. And I think we also need to talk about safeguards at some stage, because if we want to make this a global mobilization agenda, which I think we would be very interested to see being kicked off, I think we need to talk about risks and safeguards and trade-offs. So this is, from our perspective, very important. And also what had been mentioned before, we need to talk about drivers of biodiversity loss and ecosystem loss. So we cannot sort of like work on the one hand and restoring ecosystem, on the other hand not working on the drivers. So this must be somehow cross-sectoral and including a lot of stakeholders and other ministries beyond, obviously, environment. And then what else do I have on my list? Of course, there should be ideally a very nice communication campaign around that and underpinning that also with political and science, policy and science, because this agenda, as also you mentioned, serves multiple purposes. It's not only CBD, it's also like climate. It is the SDGs. It is sort of like, covers a lot of wide range of SDGs as well. And it's important that also the countries there somehow make the link to their political agendas at the same time and the national plans. And maybe lastly, I guess what we would like to see is maybe some sort of like innovative annual award or so, which maybe you can have an annual topic which encourages countries, or maybe on different levels, not only like national level, but especially like community and local level, to work on a like certain topic and have an annual award and make it like fun at the same time, and have some sort of like maybe even a website where you can also track nice examples which then pop up on a globe or so, some sort of like fun interface. I think I would stop here. And like maybe one last thing. And we would also be interested if there will be some sort of like steering committee or advisory group set up. And so, we would just like be maybe interested to maybe also participate at that level. Thank you. Sorry for taking so long.
No worries. Thank you so much. George?
Yeah, maybe just to follow up on that, I think the points you are mentioning are quite relevant, and the interesting thing about the linkage that we were saying, you're probably, since you've been working with Adriana and my colleagues, you're probably aware of IUCN and partners in the framework of the Bond Challenge have really worked in creating an overall framework that takes in consideration the issues of safeguards, principles for restoration, what kind of restoration we should do, not replacing indigenous trees versus imported, and so on, all sort of environmental, social, and economic safeguards around that, and the principles try to address that. It's kind of a holistic approach. And how do you also engage in restoration? It's not just the Ministry of Forests deciding that we are going to plant trees. How do you engage multi-stakeholder dynamics into assessing and acting so that it shouldn't be a kind of unilateral agenda being imposed on people? The sustainability part of it is quite important. So the initiatives that have been implemented, including concrete restoration actions on the ground, have generated quite a lot of learning, knowledge that we can build on. And that's where I really see this as a good platform for upscaling and outscaling. Restoration is part of the debate of sustainability, including biodiversity engagement. How do we link everything, upscale, use the UN system as a medium for really blowing this and making it a planetary agenda that is not just led by a group of stakeholders interested, but something that becomes a part of the sustainable development agenda to be implemented.
Thank you very much. The gentleman at the back, please. If you can introduce yourself.
Yes, Kile Sande from the AUDA NEPAD, yes, which you had earlier on from Levis. This really, to take it on from what the gentleman who was just spoken, yes, my interest is to learn how you're going to work within the UN systems. I happen to come from a region in the Eastern Africa, to be precise, in Uganda, where we have so many refugees from the region. And you realize that the reality is that there's a lot of stress on the ecosystems, the forest ecosystem, the waterland ecosystem, and this really working so hard, and you see the impact. Now, UNHCR, that's United Nations Refugee agencies, quite on the ground. I'd like to understand how you will work closely with these agencies to see that these programs, which are really in good light, could be implemented as quickly as possible, because the need is there to see how we can not only restore but conserve the environment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. In the interest of time, we have to finish within 3 minutes. I'm just going to respond very quickly. The colleague from Iceland, thank you so much for your intervention. I just want to mention very quickly in terms of creativity and really using the arts, because I think young people tend to resonate a lot more with that. We just signed an MOU with a company called Just Dig It. Dig It with a double G, based out of the Netherlands. And I'm the focal point for that. And they're doing something incredibly exciting. They've been doing some restoration work within the East Africa community, particularly in the drylands region with the Maasai. Now, traditionally, across Africa, I don't know about my counterparts in the room, but I have my heritage from Zambia in South Africa. When the rains came, there was a rain dance, or you prepped and you celebrated the survival of a tree. So they have a rain dance campaign, and they're going to have, on the 14th of September, 3 simultaneous concerts, 2 of which are free, one in Tanzania in Dodoma, one here in Amboseli, over 5,000 Maasai plus, coming to celebrate the survival of the trees. The other one in Amsterdam on the same day at the same time is a paid concert, and all the income generated from Amsterdam is reinvested in the work that they're doing in the region. So there's some really clever and innovative, and they're reaching out to artists and creatives. And one of the things that we're also trying to design is a champions, which Himini also alluded to. We really want to work with champions that people resonate with. What can they do and how can they engage, particularly young people? We're working very closely with the Society for Ecological Restoration. They're going to be having their big conference in South Africa. I'm actually going to present there and talk about this particular decade and how we can work, because they have thousands of scientists who've worked for years in the whole restoration agenda. Himini, you're right, the issue of language, how do we actually present this in terms of, what is it actually, how do we go beyond forests? What does it actually mean? The issue of tracking risk. There was a recent paper that was published by Lewis et al. From University College London that really talks about the challenge of monocultures. How do we also advise governments that it's not just about planting trees or planting eucalyptus, which has been a drive across Africa? How do we stop that and really work on that? Safeguards, yes, we're also working on that as part of the strategy, but really collectively. Advisory board, we are also working on the process of that. We'll let you know around this advisory committee. And then just picking up from my counterpart from NEPAD, we have had an initiative within UN Environment in particular in terms of looking at post-conflict areas and working very closely with UNHCR. This is also one of the elements that we're really wanting to work within the UN system, and as you're very much aware, the UN reform process has been going on. So how do we even enhance this within the UN reform process? So we're working very closely in that. We're sort of going through UNDP in particular, which is responsible for the reform process at the country level. But really working, we have had examples of working, I think, in the Virungas with refugees and also here in Dadaab and other regions as well, in how we green refugee spaces and also how we engage, because ultimately people have to survive. So if there's no biofuel for wood or anything of that sort, what are the alternatives and what are the options? And I think this is a bigger conversation that has been happening, and also going to be brought in Okay, I'm being told we still have 15 minutes if people can stick around. The Innovative Annual Award, I think that would be a great idea in terms of, you know, really kind of recognizing successes, and I think which is what the philosophy of the rain dance is about. How do we recognize success and celebrate that our ecosystems are recovering? As the United Nations, we are only mandated with this particular resolution to report back after 5 years of the effect of this particular decade. But I think in between, there will be a lot of touching in within different processes, either UN or otherwise, in terms of where we are at or where regions are at, so that there can be experiences shared and circulated as well. Triana, please.
Thank you. About some of the things that were mentioned before, maybe you mentioned this at the beginning, Musonda, but the idea, part of the idea of this decade is to create a mass movement, right? That's one of our key words behind the design of the strategy. So we have been talking about countries and actions at the country level, but it should trickle down to everybody. And the challenge is to design ways of involving people at all levels, including landowners, youth, etc. So that's something that we are keeping in mind. Another thing that I think Hermine mentioned is about monitoring. So one of the things that IUCN really wants to contribute and put forward for the decade is the tools that currently exist to help creating baselines and following a monitoring of progress of these ecosystem restoration initiatives. One example is, as you mentioned, the Bond Challenge Barometer, and for the ones not familiar with it, is basically a tracking tool for forest landscape restoration for countries that have made Bond Challenge pledges, but using the concept and the idea behind this barometer, we are starting the process, or we should be starting the process at least next year, I think, to expand this tracking protocol to other ecosystems. Another idea that has been discussed is to use the red list of ecosystems, the red list of species, to generate baselines and then building on those to monitor of course, progress, because progress is is the best selling point, I guess, or tracking progress is the best selling point to show that these things actually can bear results, so more ambition is needed. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. I just want to mention, I think one of the things that we have suggested is to have next year the World Environment Day to be potentially co-hosted by El Salvador and China. So it would be quite interesting, and I think the World Environment Day has obviously served as something that is very inclusive, and a lot of young people tend to be involved in that. So we're still in discussions. I don't know where we're at on that. I think our communication people are discussing with both countries to see if they can co-host that, because normally it's one country that actually hosts the World Environment Day, but we want El Salvador, that obviously suggested the decade, and because of the post-2020 COP happening in China, to also sponsor that World Environment Day process. I think we can close. This has been really exciting and very useful indeed, and I just want to thank everyone. We just circulated a paper where we wanted people to just include their names. Thank you. And as I mentioned, we've got this little booklet. I know I don't want to add on to your luggage for taking back home, but we have this little booklet called Restoring Forests and Landscapes, the Key to Sustainable Future. I have some copies here at the front that I can share with you, but if you want, I'm happy to share an electronic version with you. Thank you very much for coming.